Most Americans won't have known who Danny Finkelstein is until about a week ago. Finkelstein is a British lord. He is a member of the Conservative Party. He was important in the David Cameron years of reconfiguring the Conservative Party to be more like Tony Blair's Labour Party, the sort of new neoliberal centrist consensus. He's also a columnist for the Times of London and the Jewish Chronicle. He is a director at Chelsea Football Club. He's an accomplished author. His sister is a senior civil servant, so he wields a lot of wealth and power, and his words carry a lot of weight within the Westminster political bubble. But to anyone below the age of 30, or over on the other side of the Atlantic, especially under the age of 30, Danny Finkelstein doesn't register. Until, that is, he decided to insert himself into the debate that Piers Morgan had with Nick Fuentes. And ever since, Danny Finkelstein has spent the last week in what I assume is a bad mood, in a defensive posture, responding to anonymous provocateurs and groypers online who have said insulting things to the effect of "your mum's a bacon sandwich and your dad's a glass of milk," and other such insults. So I empathise with Danny when someone presented him with the idea of watching my coverage of the Fuentes and Morgan debate and trying to explain from a young man's perspective who recognises that Nick's rhetoric, while entertaining, can be offensive at times, why young men who didn't even agree with all of Nick's positions thought he got the better of Piers Morgan and Danny in that discussion. And when someone raised that prospect of watching the video to Danny, Danny said, "Connor is a ludicrous individual." Now, you don't exist on the internet with ears like mine without growing a thick skin. I'm basically bulletproof at this point. And Danny has since apologised for being insulting on multiple occasions, and we've had a good faith discussion. But I want to continue that discussion on video, not just because my audience requested it, but because perhaps due to my nature, I'm a little less insulting and bombastic than Nick. It's probably why lots more people watch him. He is a very talented broadcaster, and even his enemies have to recognise that, because you can't fight your enemy without acknowledging their strengths. But perhaps I can explain to Danny, and he'll have to excuse the long format, which he's complained about before, but we are relitigating an 80-year-old political consensus here, so forgive me if I have to forego brevity for depth. Perhaps I can explain Nick Fuentes' popularity, because he's far more popular than Danny Finkelstein, why Danny's continued attempts to insist that Nick is wrong is not going down well, including on a media tour that he's been done for the last few days in the aftermath of the debate, and why Danny feels like he is standing on an island around which the tide is rising, especially in light of recent jihadist attacks against Jews, both in October on Yom Kippur in Manchester in the UK, and this week on Bondi Beach at a Hanukkah party in Sydney, Australia. And I get the sense that Danny feels quite literally under fire, and I empathise. I think those attacks are horrific. But I think Danny doesn't see through the eyes of young men who also feel that they have been under siege for a very long time and have not only been denied grace and empathy by the ruling political class, of which Danny is a member. Danny supports the kind of liberal pluralist politics that has led to the kinds of atrocities committed by immigrants who have come in via mass migration and accommodated via multiculturalism, but also who, whenever they collectively bargain for their interests, noticing that every other group is allowed to do that at their expense, including Jewish people in the US and the UK, they are called things like racist, fascist, and woke right by the likes of Danny, even if they don't engage in Hitler apologia. And why Danny's worldview is straining under double standards that people do notice and are questioning in good faith. And so I'm going to question them in good faith here, and I would like to say I have invited Danny to talk about this in person twice. He has not taken up that invitation yet, but the invitation still stands, and he's welcome to any time. So, in the aftermath of the debate, Danny appeared on Piers Morgan Uncensored in person, and he said that Nick's comments are something he will live to regret. Nick flippantly dismissed both Danny and Piers as old boomers, and Nick was jubilant about his ignorance because Danny's read lots more books and lived longer than he has, and Danny's intention by appearing on the broadcast was to marginalise Nick's ideas from the right. So the purpose of Danny's appearance, and again, I'm not trying to be uncharitable here, seems to be to gatekeep certain people out of the discussion. Now, of course, the purpose of Piers Morgan Uncensored is, ostensibly, to platform people and get them to voice their own views. But then that means that free speech is not a neutral marketplace of ideas. Instead, Danny sees media and politics as instruments to advance certain causes and keep people out of certain political coalitions, despite Nick having a much larger organic audience than Danny's. And so this hasn't resonated because people don't like the feeling that they're being told what to think and what they can and cannot say. So you're already starting on a losing footing with Nick's audience, who are largely young men who have felt like they have been told for a very long time what they can't say by institutions that has nothing but contempt for them, that depicts them as the villains of history for their race and sex, and has elected an offensive, provocative, devil-may-care avatar of their concerns in Nick Fuentes, who is willing to say anything and be cancelled from everywhere in order to get his point across. And the reason he flippantly said, "You're a boomer, who cares, Hitler had aura, and that Joseph Stalin is one of his political icons," is because he's deliberately pushing the buttons of the post-war moral order, which is an ideological structure that is permanently suspicious of white majorities, because if they advocate for their own civilizations, if they take their own side, if they express in positive terms their identity and an affinity for their culture, their history, and their nation, then that will lead ineluctably to gas chambers and goose stepping and the return of Adolf Hitler. And this, as I expressed in my previous coverage of Nick and Piers' debate, was even mentioned by Nick in regards to the Open Society. This is the thesis of R.R. Reno's book, Return of the Strong Gods. Yoram Hazony has written about this. There have been lots of books by serious and considered academics that Danny would perhaps consider far more moderate than Nick Fuentes, who don't engage in insults and dancing round landmines for fun. And so this argument is perfectly legitimate. And what Danny's doing is he's starting off on the losing foot by saying to those young men, you need to buttress this moral order that gives you nothing to lose by tipping it over. And if you continue to be offended or worried or susceptible to our charges of racist, fascist, misogynist, homophobe, Hitler, then you will end up not just second-class citizens in your own civilization, but you will end up extinct, cheered on gleefully, without consequences, by the likes of Wajahat Ali, the former New York Times columnist and author, who was just on camera the other day gloating about the fact that he hates white people, he wants to sleep with their women, he thinks their culture and their music sucks, and he sees immigration as a kind of demographic and cultural warfare, and such gleeful anti-white rhetoric did not get him deplatformed from Piers Morgan Uncensored. He was a panelist only just a few days ago. So there is a clear double standard here where groups can organise at the expense of white majorities who are regarded with suspicion by minorities, be they sexual, racial, or religious, in their own countries. And when ethnocidal rhetoric is levelled at those white majorities, that's not a cause for ending those careers. But if there is positive rhetoric, such as slogans that were bandied about for 10 years, it's okay to be white, that is cause for cancellation. That is cause for an accusation of white supremacy or being placed on a hate watch list by Hope Not Hate or the Southern Poverty Law Centre or the Anti-Defamation League. And so you can only sustain that double standard for so long before people just embrace the labels because they have nothing to lose. They just say, as Nick did, I am a racist. And what he should have continued that sentence with is, by your standards, by the liberal standards that says, I notice differences and I take my own side of my own people, just as every other group is allowed to do, except us. And Danny then went on Times Radio, where he is a frequent contributor, and he said Nick Fuentes puts himself outside reasonable discourse. And what I don't think Danny understands is what he considers reasonable discourse is very different to the young white men who have grown up in civilizations that has marginalized them to the benefit of every other intersectional identity group. They don't consider it to be reasonable discourse that they be called names forever until they are driven to extinction, and in the meantime, the proceeds of their work are taxed, taken, and redistributed to be given to groups that hate them, who are made clients and wards of the state. They don't consider it to be reasonable discourse that they get called those names if they resist that state of affairs that seems to confer no advantages on them and seems to be done in a very vindictive fashion. And so, it's not reasonable to denigrate them or uphold the moral order that denigrates them by proxy of attacking someone who is provocatively attacking that moral order. It doesn't seem reasonable to them for them to sit down, shut up, and take it. And so you don't see it reasonable to them, Danny. This is the problem. You've put yourself completely on the outs with them. And that's why this article didn't help. I mean, first of all, the framing is poor because you didn't take on Nick Fuentes. You didn't. Nick didn't know that you were going to be part of the debate. You didn't stream in live, you didn't have a discussion with him, you gave him a pre-recorded message that came across to viewers, and I say this dispassionately because I don't know Nick, I've met Piers once and did his show 4 years ago, so it's not like I'm angling to go back on the show. As a viewer, nothing more, it just looked like a book plug. It looked like you were drawing upon your family's pain and anguish, for which you do actually have my sympathies, in order to morally browbeat Nick Fuentes, and at the same time, promote your book to anyone who might be listening. So, you didn't take him on, you inserted a pre-recorded advertisement into a discussion between two other parties, and Nick didn't even know who you were. And that's why he was so insulting both in the debate and since. And in this article, Danny makes some interesting observations. So he says, here are some thoughts that these events have prompted. First, if you shut your eyes, it won't go away. A perfectly reasonable argument made by intelligent people I respect is that appearing on the Morgan show was a mistake, and it was a mistake for Piers to interview Fuentes. All it did was give him a bigger platform. Actually, Nick gets 1 million live viewers a day. So Nick has his own platform. Danny writes, his own appearance and mine are what he would have wanted, and it was an error to grant him that. But I don't agree. 20 years ago, it might have been possible by refusing to invite Fuentes to appear on mainstream media to deny him any sort of audience. Now this is not possible. He already has more than 1 million followers on X, and a popular show in which he streams to thousands, taunting Danny's mother while people give him money. Social media has changed political communication profoundly. It has, and yes, it has incentivized sensationalism and mean-spiritedness. I'm not saying that Nick doesn't actually believe the things he says. He certainly mixes his political rhetoric in with hyperbole and offensive jokes, much like the sort of 90s comedians did back in the liberal era, and up until now, people like John Oliver and Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert, where they do the, clown nose on, clown nose off routine, where they make a serious political statement in favour of some wacky progressive policy, and the moment you say, well, those numbers don't add up, that policy's ridiculous, they go, well, I'm just a comedian, I don't know why you're getting mad at me. They play this Mott and Bailey game. So Nick is just an amplified version of that. But also the reason social media has changed political communication, as Mary Harrington has observed in an Unheard column where I think it's titled something like Why All of Gen Z Are Racist, basically. Racist by the definition of noticing differences. A video camera and a social media feed and algorithm combined means that more people than ever are seeing direct video evidence of how different groups behave, especially when they interact with one another. And so, more people than ever are noticing, for example, that black people in the United States commit violent crime at higher rates than white people, and they commit rates of crime against white people far higher than white people commit it against black people. So there is an enforcement cost to telling this generation, who have grown up as digital natives on social media with camera phones, to ignore their lying eyes and not notice patterns. And therefore, people who are going to provoke blank slate liberal taboos about everyone being equal, there being no group differences, that deep down everyone is exactly the same, people that are going to provoke those taboos are going to naturally amass an audience if nobody else is saying that same thing. Danny continues, so it is essential he be challenged even if he isn't going to just curl up into a ball and ask to be sent on an awareness course. Do you not think, I understand this is a joke, but that things like prevent training or diversity training actually engender more resentment in those young men who feel gaslit and insulted and like they're being placed in a no-win situation? Because what you have to understand, Danny, is every young man has grown up with the narrative that they are the villains of history, and the arch villain of history, the avatar of what white people can do when they go too far, is Adolf Hitler. So if you set up a dichotomy, which I think you did with your appearance in the debate, of either buttress the post-war liberal world order, all of the contradictions contained therein, all of the potential for you to be insulted by aggrieved minority groups, have your income taxed and spent on them, and fight one hand behind your back at all times because if you try to collectively organise, we will call you racist, fascist, and woke right, or become Adolf Hitler, or at least be compared to Adolf Hitler, you're going to get a lot more young men with nothing to lose just going, well, fuck it, I guess I'm Hitler. Now, I haven't taken that step, perhaps because there are other figures in English history who deserve our respect instead. Alfred, Athelstan, Richard the Lionheart, etc. But there are going to be a lot of young men whose historical horizons are not so broad and will inhabit the framing provided to them by every institution, every cultural artifact, and the people trying to browbeat them, whether on the delusional progressive left or the self-defined centre-right like yourself. What you're basically doing, Danny, is backing them into a corner and saying either you go in extinct and you can't complain about the ethnocidal rhetoric being trumpeted by every institution, every media outlet, every cultural product, or you're Adolf Hitler. And they go, well, okay, Hitler. Danny continues. Second, when Fuentes calls me some old guy and his cult followers go on about Morgan and me being boomers, they have a point. And I think they do. I think you're entirely detached from the circumstances that these young men have grown up in, and which has made them impervious to your moral claims. He says, it's quite clear we have entered a post-war era in which many of the lessons of the mid-20th century appear abstract and irrelevant to the new generation. The mistakes of militant blood and soil nationalism and communist ideology which seem so obvious to us are no longer obvious to people in their 20s. Dissatisfied with the failings of modern capitalist democracies, many of them haven't much patience for old lessons from history books. The only way to address this, I suppose, is to lessen the failings of modern capitalist democracies. Yes, but it's not like we haven't had Hitler and the Holocaust beaten into us for, going on in mine and Nick's life now, 30 years. We're both 27. We know that our Adolf Hitler is the secular Satan of the 20th century. But again, if you say that having a preference for your own people, history, and civilization, taking your own side in a fight where every single group can attack you as a group, but you're demanded to be an individual, is indistinguishable from Adolf Hitler, then people are going to be driven to desperation and either say, I guess it's Hitler, or identify deliberately with Hitler and the Nazis, even if they don't sincerely believe in things like perpetrating a Holocaust or Holodomor, which Nick has repeatedly said he doesn't, just to offend you, just to challenge those taboos which stay in place as the foundations of a system which systemically disadvantages them. Inequalities law, in the Civil Rights Act, in DEI policies, in culture that has recast all of their heroes as either villains or race and gender swapped them, has said that they deserve no positive attributes, no virtue, no pathway to meaningful and gainful employment. They don't deserve a family, they don't deserve a home, they don't deserve to have a heritage they can pass off to their children. All of the natural things that Danny thinks makes life for Jewish people very rich, young white men have been deprived of, specifically because of the suspicion that if they have them, they will deprive them from minorities in the same way that the Nazis took the lives of Jews. And I'm sorry, that's just not a moral order that can last. You cannot browbeat and insult your majority population forever, because protections for minorities is not reliant on abstract values or international laws. It is reliant on reciprocity between respective parties. Any relationship that isn't reciprocal is exploitative. And so, when you say, Danny, that the mistakes of militant blood and soil nationalism and communist ideology seem so obvious to you, it actually isn't so obvious to us that you hate both blood and soil nationalism and communism in equal measure, despite writing Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, because you shared a sofa with Ash Sarkar, a self-described literal communist, on the BBC to talk about Nick Fuentes. And Ash Sarkar insinuated that he should, quote, follow his leader. Basically, that Nick Fuentes should punctuate his life in the same way that Adolf Hitler did. The fact that you were smiling during her saying that, it means that your revealed preference is to side with the ethnocidal communist left against what presumably is your true enemy, the nativist right, and their more provocative elements who will deliberately use Hitler and Stalin to offend you, which I am not doing, but which Ash Sarkar does against me. She celebrated the decline in indigenous white Brits as a percentage share of their own country, inevitably receding into a minority before 2066, as, quote, we're winning, lads. She celebrated her, I think it was her aunt's, Bengali nationalist terrorism against the British. She defined woke as the expropriation of wealth, power, land, and recognition away from straight white men towards racial, sexual, minority groups. So she is a race communist. She is a communist with a specific hatred of white people, and you're not just happy to share a sofa with her. You didn't feel the need to browbeat her, as you did with Nick, about her apologia for a murderous socialist ideology. And Marxism is explicitly murderous, I've read the text, as have you. Instead, you smiled at her. So people can see this. Again, social media is a pattern recognition amplifier. And so it amplifies patterns of behaviour. And the behaviour appears to be, from you, Danny, from the self-described centre, to play whack-a-mole with any young white man who takes his own side and hold the mallet with one hand, and the other hand on the mallet is the people that you purport to stand against on the far left. The only time it actually seems that you stand against far leftists is not when they attack those young white men. It's when they attack Jewish people. Now, they shouldn't be attacking Jewish people, because as a Christian, I think we're all made in the image of God, and despite our differences, no person deserves to be violently persecuted. And I think any atrocity in which people are maimed and killed is appalling, regardless of their ethnicity. But, Danny, it has been observed that until the Bondi Beach massacre, you were insisting that somewhere like London is actually entirely safe. Now, there is a rape reported every hour. More than half of those rapes are committed by foreign men, either holding a foreign passport or naturalised British citizens, but were born abroad, or second-generation immigrants, even third. So, the majority of sex attacks in London are committed by men who never needed to be here. But liberal blank slate ideology demands we can't notice differences between those people, and a permissive migration and asylum policy, which you support, means they are here, and it's very hard to remove them. And the people that are noticing this, like Rupert Lowe, courageously, you're saying, You live in the city just like he does, total twaddle. Now, Danny, I think you might be insulated from those crimes a little bit, because I don't doubt that you probably don't get public transport for your own safety. Completely understand that. You're probably wealthy enough to have a cab. You probably live in a homogenous suburb of London. You're not living in Brixton. You're not living in Whitechapel. You're not living in Peckham. And, as you said, for you, London is one of the safest places in the world. Now, this was about a day before the Bondi Beach massacre. And then, when Jews are slaughtered in Sydney, Australia, you then say, you no longer feel London is safe. And you cite chants like Globalise the Intifada. They have been chanting Globalise the Intifada for quite some time. I would put to you that even if there weren't Jews in London, in Britain, Muslims would still chant Globalise the Intifada. Because the ambition of a global caliphate holds Christians in just as much contempt as it does Jews. Of course, they believe in the hadiths that it's not until Judgment Day won't come until they fight and kill the Jews, and Allah will assist them in that enterprise. But if you notice, the Pakistani rape gangs had nothing to do with Israel or Jews. They were targeting white English girls because they were kuffar and because they were white. It was a racial, religious, and political crime, because we now have the transcripts where, for example, one of the perpetrators says, we're here to F white girls and F the government. So they are explicit in their motivations, and they have been operating in London. And Sadiq Khan has been very squeamish about admitting this, but there have been leaks from the Met Police that say, yep, we know grooming gangs are going on in London, they're still going on and they haven't been stopped. This has been happening for decades. There are random stabbings in London, constantly. We have felt unsafe in our capital city for a very long time. But you, only a couple of days ago, were saying it's one of the safest places in the world. You're still insisting it's one of the safest places in the world. You're maintaining this cognitive dissonance. But you only say that you feel unsafe when Jews are targeted in another city. Do you see how people might be frustrated with you because you're not taking our side? You are taking the side of your ethnic and religious group. Now, I do not blame you for that, but when people do take our side, you call them woke right. Or you call them white victims. So, you are asking for protections and political consideration that you then insult the native white population for also asking for in their own country. And that is why people are angry at you. And they're very, very angry at you because, and I know that you say this is your home, of course, because if things get really unsafe for Jews, you do have Israel to go to. It will protect you. It is a state to protect Jewish people. It was founded in 1948 by secular socialists under David Ben-Gurion to protect the ethnic Jewish people, not protect one particular denomination of Judaism as a religion. We don't have an Israel of our own. England, for us, is not Osgiliath. It is not a city that can be sacked by orcs for us to retreat to the White Towers of Gondor in Minas Tirith and wait it out. It is our only place where we make our stand. And so, when we're trying to make that stand, when we're trying to take our own side, we don't appreciate being insulted. And again, this is a pattern of unilateral inconsiderateness in your writing. So, Danny wrote this piece saying for the first time in his life that he now feels fear lighting the Hanukkah candles. He wrote, after the Manchester synagogue killing in October, he wrote that we cannot tolerate radical Islamic preachers, hate chants, or people calling to globalize the Intifada. I've been saying this for a very long time and I'm not Jewish. It's because I've read the Islamic texts. I'm well aware of the fact that they hate white people, they hate Christians, and they have targeted us in the Bataclan massacre, the Charlie Hebdo killing, the killing of Theo van Gogh in the Netherlands, the Westminster Bridge attack, the London Bridge attacks, the Ariana Grande bombing, the Lee Rigby murders, on and on and on. Take your pick. It's not only bad because it's now also happening to Jews in Sydney and in Manchester. But, he says, I admit, for the first time in my life this year, I do feel just a little fear as he lights the candles. I never thought I'd write that, but here we are. Okay, Danny, you now know how, for example, the parents of Epping felt sending their children to school to be preyed upon in uniform by illegal immigrants. But while you now feel fear lighting your Hanukkah candles because of the evil massacre in Australia, when that was happening, you wrote this article, There is no future in the politics of victimhood, which again, I covered on my channel at the time, and you didn't like my coverage. Do you now accept that my criticisms were valid? At the time, Danny wrote, there are great advantages to pluralism. Of course there are. Advantages to individuals like my parents who can find safety or build a better life in a foreign land, but also to host nations which benefit from different perspectives and from people who arrive with energy and imagination. But nonetheless, maintaining harmony and stability turns out to be difficult, and that is not simply because not everybody in a mixed population is energetic and imaginative. So, Danny demands that we, the host majority, make concessions to our identity, to our political preferences, and not collectively organise against people we don't want in the country, even when they're committing crimes. But when Jews are attacked by the same demographic, foreign, largely Muslim, violent men, then this means that our capital city is unsafe. This means that Jews must have more protections. This means that the global Jewish diaspora must collectively organise to secure their own safety. There is a double standard here that you can't sustain. And so, if young men and young women who are being replaced and insulted and put at the back of the queue in their own country, and young women who are being preyed upon by these foreign predators, if they are told, if you try and collectively bargain for your safety and security in the same way that Jewish diasporas do, very effectively, by the way, and understandably, then you are Adolf Hitler, then you're going to get them fall behind the guy who just says, yep, guess it's Hitler then. Because they've got nothing to lose, except their lives. And they're just not willing to do that. They would rather be alive and save their civilization and be called racist than not be called those names and lose everything. You've backed them into a corner, and that's why you have lost them. That's why they don't see you as reasonable. That's why Nick has a much larger following than you do. That is why you have a generational hard cap on anyone listening to what you say, either on the full-throated, revolutionary, third-worldist, Islamo-Marxist left, or the nativist right. And that's why people are annoyed when you say, everything's going fine, we're all rubbing shoulders and getting along nicely one day, and then when Jews are massacred, the next, it's completely unsafe. And you don't notice that cognitive dissonance. You won't admit to it. And this is why, in this article, people are very, very frustrated because that Muslim terrorism against Jews and whites alike is the inevitable consequence of immigration policy that you support. And you say here, for more than a quarter of a century, in active politics and in this column, I have been warning against allowing mass migration into the UK. But what have you substantively done in policy terms or in rhetorical terms to do that? Because you say here, my concern was less the numbers than the speed. Right, so you want millions and millions and millions of people from anywhere and everywhere to move into the country just at a pace which doesn't disrupt the political consensus that allows mass migration to continue. You don't want it to be destabilised. You just want this massive demographic change, which people don't want, Danny, to continue. So you are not in line with the public here. And when the public complain, you then call them racist, which is why people are annoyed at you. You say, let us welcome people, but not huge and rapid movements that have allowed little or no time for integration. This is why people are annoyed. It's not hypothetical anymore. The experiment has been run with disastrous consequences. People do not assimilate. They don't want to. Most can't, especially if they're from civilizations with low IQs and high levels of cousin marriage, right? They just don't think like you and me. I'm sure it does baffle you that people don't live and let live. But it's because you don't have a theory of mind for the kinds of people being brought into our countries, and when people complain about that, and when people get that issue right, for example, warning that you're going to get jihadist terrorism against Jews and whites if you import any Muslims at all, you then say they're racist and indulging in the politics of white victimhood. And the reason that you sustain an order which imports these people and keeps them in the country and prevents us from deporting them is because you say, my family has been safe here precisely because of British culture, We want to be part of it. I hope we've enriched it, but I would never wish to either ignore or erase it. Okay, you are erasing it under the guise of identifying with immigrants and refugees and saying the laws that allowed your parents to come into the country and live in Britain in safety need to stay in place even when they no longer apply to Jews fleeing the pogroms of Soviet Russia or Hitler's Holocaust, but instead they now apply to North African rapists who want to attack white women because they've been shown TikToks of white women who are drunk and dressed immodestly by Muslim standards by people traffickers to entice them to use their services via Islamic finance to break into Europe and end up in Britain. They are completely different people. We live in different times. We labour under different crises, and you're demanding that the old order that followed the crisis of the 20th century remain in place even though it's completely antiquated and inflicting horrors in the 21st century. And the people that are pointing out, yet again, you're calling racist. Here, you say, for example, that mass migration has produced a multi-ethnic society, that multi-ethnic societies are hard, and that we need to stop making things harder. But that this will not be undone anytime soon. Well, I'm sorry. People are allowed to want that process to be undone. But when they want to undo it, you say the white majority population is making its own bid for victim status. Well, I'm sorry, Danny, but if the politics of victimhood had no purchase, then why are you saying Jews are unsafe in Sydney and in London and presumably in the United States where they've been attacked in Washington, D.C. and New York? If the politics of victimhood have no substantive gains, why does Israel exist to protect Jewish people from being victimized? Why does it need to exist? It seems instead to people that you're depriving a legitimate means of political organization from the white majorities of Europe and the UK and the US and the rest of the Anglosphere that Jews are afforded and that you think is necessary because Jews are unsafe. But when white people recognize they're unsafe, you call them victims. This is why you have no natural political constituency, and this is why, if nobody listens to those concerns, then the most offensive person you don't like, who is the only one talking about them, is going to get the largest audience. Hey presto, Nick Fuentes. This is why people feel, Danny, that you aren't taking their side when you write, I accept that this probably sounds a bit quaint, so be it. I realise combining a tough position on immigration, which you haven't provided, with some sort of limit on the exploitation of feelings of white victimhood is now deeply unfashionable. But I can't advocate open borders, and I can't join in ethnic war either. Well, you don't provide any opposition to open borders, other than it's all going a bit fast. You don't say there should be cultural or ethnic or civilizational limits on migration. You don't support an immigration moratorium. You don't support evicting the same ethnic and religious enclaves that make Jews and whites unsafe from our country. Instead, we just sort of seem hypothetically stuck with this problem forever, otherwise you'll call us racist. And so, when you say the following from your Nick Fuentes article, the battle isn't now to protect Jews against reactionary hatred, it is to protect all of us against reactionary hatred. I've got your back and I know you've got mine. People don't believe you. People think, instead, that you're allowing identity politics for Jewish people to protect them, which is understandable, but at the same time, you're saying that the white majorities, who are also being attacked in the same way by the same people, then they just have to purely lobby for their interests as atomized individuals. Otherwise, if they do collectively organize, they're either indulging in the politics of white victimhood, which somehow isn't successful, though Jewish people, when they are victimized, they collectively organize to ensure their insecurity, or they're indistinguishable from Adolf Hitler. At which point people say, okay, guess I need to be Hitler in order to protect myself then. And so this is at the root of my dispute with Danny Finkelstein. Because Danny posted this clip where Nick was insulting him, and someone recommended that Danny watch my coverage of his and Piers Morgan's debate. And Danny responded that some people agree with me, sure, but it's people that agree with me that live in a bubble. And again, Danny, you genuinely live in the Westminster bubble. I get the train into London. I've grown up in the outskirts of London all my life from a working class family that is not well connected like yours. I didn't get a leg up in politics. I just started running my mouth, and some people listened, and I've since been cancelled from basically everywhere. Nick is in the same position. He wasn't from a wealthy family. He grew up in one of the meaner areas of Chicago, and we have both experienced throughout our lives being shit on from a great height by every institution that just doesn't like white men, regardless of whether or not Nick and I agree on everything or even have the same vernacular or inclination to be insulting. So you don't understand why we don't agree with you, because we weren't brought up in the same way. We weren't brought up in the same political environment. We weren't as wealthy as one another. And all I'm asking is for a little bit of humility and understanding. And fortunately, I do think that you gave that to me after I did the following post. And I responded saying, Danny, I say the following without any animosity. The way I see it, you have two options. You can either continue to insist on the unsustainable double standard that Israel gets to be a state that protects the ethnic Jewish people, while the UK, US, and Europe must be liberal, pluralistic, and multicultural. That Jews can collectively bargain, form advocacy groups, elect representatives, and petition for redress of their grievances, but if whites do the same, they're profiting from the politics of victimhood and are just one goose step away from Auschwitz. You can keep expressing your horror at the ongoing and historic atrocities committed against Jews while supporting the migration policies which visit comparable horrors like the Pakistani rape gangs on whites. You can continue to condemn and call for the censorship of provocateurs like Nick Fuentes while failing to understand how his audience organically dwarfs yours. Or you could reassess your priors, wonder if the state of affairs that your politics brought about, where whites and Jews are slaughtered in equal measure by men with no right to be here, is as desirable as you thought it would be, and enter into dialogue with interlocutors who were right about these problems when you weren't. The former position will just cause more people to hurl abuse at you, grow unsympathetic to the torture endured by your family, and become suspicious of Jewish people and their desire to protect themselves as a minority more broadly. The latter might just help fix our country, cause a de-escalation in rhetoric, and end up with England enjoying all the things that you think Israel should have. You're a much more powerful person than I am. I'm half your age, and I've only grown up in a world where your politics have been ubiquitous. So ludicrous as I might be, I and all the young men who agree with me are just a byproduct of the Britain that you helped create. If you actually want to understand why we think what we think, let's set the internet blood sports aside and chat. My DMs are open. And this is the core of the issue. Why does Israel get to be an ethno-state to protect the Jewish people, but Britain has to be multi-ethnic, multicultural, liberal, pluralist, accommodating to refugees despite the legitimacy of their claim? And when people say, well, I want the indigenous British people to possess their own country, I want to remove hostile, troublesome elements from that country on the grounds that they are incompatible with our civilization and putting our lives at risk, I basically want the same model of national sovereignty that Israel enjoys. Well, we are called woke right, racist, engaging in the politics of white victimhood, and goose-stepping down the road towards becoming Adolf Hitler. And I'm sorry, you can't sustain that double standard, especially when people's lives are being taken because we're practicing liberal multiculturalism. If you recognize the undesirable situation that Jewish people live in their own homeland, surrounded on all sides by hostile states that will board buses in Jerusalem and decide to blow them up or shoot civilians dead, then why would you recreate those fractured demographics and cultural tensions in our country when we're an island off the coast of Europe and those people, those 1,000-year blood feuds, they're just not native here. They weren't needed. They're not needed. They could be removed by a government with sufficient courage, but instead, you keep calling people racist for wanting that. It's not. It's normal and it's natural, and eventually, people will want it so badly that they don't care if you call them racist. They're just going to do whatever they need to do in order to get it. And you're therefore making that kind of politics inevitably uglier the more that you put it off. So Danny responded, saying, if you wish to support Nick Fuentes, which I know you basically want to, you can do that in a couple of sentences. You have a habit of going on for 45 minutes saying quite simple things. Well, I apologise for the length of this show, but I think that was needlessly mean-spirited. And I think Danny recognises that was needlessly mean-spirited, and, he's since apologised for it. But he then said, Let me give you a brief but serious answer. Britain is a Christian nation, and I have always respected it as such. I believe that it is practical and humane to allow limited migration into the country, but I oppose rapid mass migration. Well, you still said millions of people, so that's not limited, Danny. I insist that those who come here understand what Britain is and accommodate to it. Okay, what is a British person? Because I think we probably have very different definitions. I think you would define it according to values. Whereas Britain has indigenous ethnicities just as much as Jews are an ethnic people too. Then he says, my grandparents came here because of their assistance to the British war effort, and my family has lived by the principle I outline. Israel is a Jewish nation, as Britain is a Christian one. There needs to be somewhere in the world for Jews to be a broad majority, but I live here. And I'm not accusing Danny of being bad faith, but I notice a sleight of hand here. Israel is a Jewish nation. It is an ethnically Jewish nation, not a religious nation. Judaism is a religion, but Israel exists first and foremost to protect the ethnic Jewish people. It's why there's a right of return policy. However, he says Britain is a Christian nation. It is, and Christianity is inextricable from the evolution of England. Read Alan Macfarlane's Origins of English Individualism for how it shaped our family formation, with prohibitions on cousin marriage, for example. But it's not just a vessel for every Christian around the world to come to. Even if you only limited immigration to Christian immigration, Britain would not remain Britain if Britain was 100% Nigerian Christian, 100% Indian Catholic. Because peoples are different. We have different habits, different family structures, different heroes, different histories, different preferences. We've grown up in different climates, in different cultures. And so people are not interchangeable, even if the faith is the same. Even if you apply that slight modifier on blank slate universalism. This is still not affording Britain the same standard of nationhood as Israel. It deserves the same standard. Indigenous Brits deserve to be an unquestionable majority in their own homeland, and they deserve to pursue any policies necessary in order to secure their demographic majority. And that means refusing entry to anyone they don't want here, and also removing people from the country that they don't want here. Now, the only way that friendly minorities will be able to live in the country, like yourself, Danny, is if you form good relationships with that host majority, with the people and the families that comprise that population. And you do that by taking their side. And it doesn't feel like you've taken our side at the moment. Now, I'm not one of these people that's encouraging you to be removed, as I'm sure people have suggested in your comment sections. What I'm encouraging you to do is to empathize with our population, empathize with young men who don't agree with you, even including some of the mean-spirited people that follow Nick Fuentes, understand their concerns, and rather than browbeat them and dismiss them, understand that what they're basically asking for is to be treated in their own countries the same way that Jews are treated in Israel. And if you say, flat out, England deserves what Israel has, then people will stop being pissed off at you tomorrow. Because that is reasonable and it's all that people are asking for. And the policy consequences that flow downstream of that are a negotiation. But do you know how you secure the future of friendly minorities, like Jewish people, in England? It's not through abstract values or international laws or a politics of double standards that requires the indigenous majority to imbibe intergenerational guilt. Two, as a guest said on Andrew Marr's show on LBC just the other day, that they should feel collectively guilty about the Holocaust. It's not that. The way that you preserve people who are not natively of that land, in that land, is by having the people to whom the country belongs, wanting them there, to consider them as friends rather than enemies. And the way that you fall on the enemy side of the aisle is teaming up with Ash Sarkar, is calling concerned parents in Epping white victim politics, is calling people woke right, is using the horrors of the Holocaust and the Holodomor as reasons why Britain does not get to have the same ethnic protectionist policies as Israel. I'm sorry, but that double standard just cannot be sustained. Now, after Danny apologized to me, I then responded to him by saying, I'm glad we got past insults. Bear with me, but relitigating a decades-old political consensus may require some longer posts or videos like this one. So some questions. If Britain restricted migration on the grounds of cultural proximity and compatibility rather than quantity and speed, would you support that? A flat ban on, say, migration outside of Western Europe or certain countries in Eastern Europe, like Hungary, for example, or Poland. The Anglosphere, and perhaps Japan and South Korea, as well as a drastic reduction of overall numbers. If we sought to denaturalize and deport incompatible foreign populations who live in ways anathema to our Christian nation, would you support that? Because that's what people are asking for. That's why 45% of people, according to YouGov, support removing millions, large numbers, of legal migrants. Remigration is the popular position in the country. Would you support it, Danny? You are seen by those people as throwing stumbling blocks in the way of those demands with your articles, Danny, even when those imported populations are making you and Jews just as unsafe and unwelcome as white Brits. That's why you're being so heavily criticised. I'm just trying to explain why and find out whether our differences of opinion are irreconcilable. The tension between Britain being multicultural and accommodating, while Israel is a Jewish state for Jewish people, remains unresolved, and it wasn't mentioned in Danny's response to my original post, even though I mentioned it in that post. But it's a question that people are asking, and it's not in bad faith. Danny hasn't responded to this post, but he has responded to other posts in the meantime, and I think it demonstrates where his thinking is currently at, and it's incongruous if he holds universal morals rather than just being principally concerned with the fate of the ethnic Jewish people at the expense of all other peoples. At which point, if you're just acting in favour of your in-group, I mean, that's totally understandable, but it's not my in-group, and therefore, as Nick has recognised, he doesn't have to listen to you. Now, if you are a moral universalist, Danny, then we can have that conversation, and I think that you're just getting it wrong. If you're not a moral universalist, then you basically have no purchase with young men who are recognising that every other group seems to be in favour of their own group, and so, at their expense, they're advocating for individualistic universalism, but everyone else is playing identity politics, which depicts them as the adversary, and so they stop playing their own identity politics. And when you say, well, you can't play identity politics, they think you're either a hypocrite or you're just trying to gain an advantage over them, so you have no moral currency with them. And so when people said, for example, that your position is migration caps, increasing migration but at a slower rate, but that you didn't support the rights of the native English for ethnic balance, deportations, he says, yes, my position isn't the same as yours. So you support massive demographic change just at a pace that won't cause the natives to be pissed off enough to raise a rabble about it and, as you say, indulge in the politics of white victimhood. But you don't support Britain having the same policy of demographic security that Israel does for Jews. Again, people just aren't going to agree with you then, and they just aren't going to take you seriously when you start calling them names. Danny's trying to maintain a double standard. He wrote, again, in a post released after my second response that he hasn't replied to, not to be able to understand at all how a reasonable Jew might support homeland for Jews is a pretty big hole in comprehension, even if you end up disagreeing, all the best. Okay, Danny. Not to be able to understand at all how a reasonable young white man might support homeland for young white men is a pretty big hole in your comprehension. There is no Israel for us. If things go badly in Britain, as they have been for decades, if we become a minority in our own country, there is no country that we can flee to where we are a majority. You have Israel, Danny. I have nothing but England. I didn't want to become a minority in my own country. That's what my children, that I'm hopefully, God willing, going to have next year, are facing because of the policies that you support. Now, if you're unsympathetic to that, if you want to maintain this double standard, then people aren't going to listen to you. And what they're going to do instead is they're going to side with the guy who is insulting the atrocities committed against your parents. And look, I don't think it's fair to be so mean-spirited about the atrocities that were inflicted upon your parents, which is why I haven't done it. But lots of people won't care. They're going to side with the guy who makes offensive statements, but ultimately is acting in the interest of their people, rather than the guy who complains about the offensive statements, but does absolutely nothing to stop them going extinct. If Danny's got this far, I'm interested in his response. But he says that Chaim Weizmann wanted Israel to be as Jewish as England is English at the time. This meant that the Anglos, the English ethnic people, had a home where they are the permanent majority. And Danny says he meant by this really the opposite of your point. He meant that Israel should have a Jewish character, but that it shouldn't be exclusively for Jews. He wanted Israel to be what England is. Okay. When he was talking about that, England was upwards of 99% white English. And if the Jews became a minority in Israel, it would cease to have a Jewish character. Because the character comes from the people, the culture comes from the people, the civilization comes from the people. And so replacing those people with another people does not reproduce their civilization, any more than if Israel was entirely Indian, it would no longer have a Jewish character. Would it, Danny? And so, if England ceases to be English, there is no English character, there is no English people, there is no England. And so, people are frustrated that you're basically foisting this upon them while calling them all sorts of names. The same goes for America. If America ceases to be majority heritage American, which is a complicated mixture, but if it ceases to be the population to whom the Constitution and American culture, with all its bravado, is second nature, if it ceases to be that majority, it will no longer have the character of that country. It will just be the Ozymandian ruins of a civilization with total strangers stumbling about, picking up the flecks of treasure among the ruins that still remain, or returning to their own nations that are just as dilapidated as when they left them. People don't want that, Danny. And that's why, if you don't change your mind, that entire generation that you're worried will forget the atrocities of history will just leave you behind. Out of desperation, if nothing else.